Have you ever wondered about the rules that govern our lives? Not just the laws of the land, but the unspoken codes we live by. The things we consider right or wrong, clean or dirty. Deep in the heart of the Old Testament, in a book called Leviticus, lies a complex system of rules that has puzzled scholars and believers for centuries. They are intricate, detailed instructions about every facet of daily existence. These ancient laws dictated what people could eat, how they should behave after childbirth, and even how to handle something as common as mold on a wall. For the ancient Israelites, these rules were more than just a list of do's and don'ts. They were a blueprint for life, a way to live in harmony with the divine. The concepts of clean and unclean were central to their entire worldview. To be clean was to be whole, to be in a state where one could approach God. To be unclean was to be set apart, in a state of ritual impurity that required specific actions to be resolved. This wasn't necessarily about sin or moral failing. It was about order and separation, about maintaining a sacred space in a chaotic world. It's easy to dismiss these ancient purity laws as primitive or irrelevant to our modern lives. We have science, medicine, and a completely different understanding of health and disease. But what if these rules are not just about hygiene? What if they are a language, a complex symbolic system, designed to teach something much deeper about life, community, and the nature of holiness? Think of it as a cosmic map. Every rule, every ritual, was a landmark guiding the Israelites on their journey. The separation of animals into clean and unclean categories might have been a daily reminder to distinguish between order and chaos, between the life God intended and the forces that disrupt it. The laws concerning childbirth and disease were not meant to shame or punish, but to manage powerful life events, birth, and the threat of death, within a framework of community care and sacred order. The ancient Israelites didn't have microscopes to see germs, but they understood that some things could spread and disrupt the health of the entire camp. Their laws created a system of public health, quarantine, and diagnosis, all overseen by the priests. It was a holistic approach where physical health and spiritual purity were completely intertwined, and the well-being of the individual was inseparable from the well-being of the whole. Welcome back to Bible Stories and Chronicles channel. If you like to hear beautiful stories from Bible, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. This will be very meaningful to us. Thank you. The journey into the heart of Leviticus's purity code begins with one of the most fundamental human activities, eating. Chapter 11 lays out a detailed dietary guide, a sort of divine menu for the people of Israel. The first category addressed is the land animals. For an animal to be considered clean and therefore edible, it had to meet two specific criteria. It must have a completely divided hoof, and it must chew the cud. Animals like cattle, sheep, and goats fit these criteria perfectly. They were the animals of order, the ones that fit neatly into the system God was establishing. However, the law then provides examples of animals that fail the test. The camel chews the cud but does not have a divided hoof. Therefore, it was declared unclean. The pig has a perfectly split hoof but does not chew the cud, perhaps the most famously unclean animal. The divine classification system did not stop on dry land. It extended into the waters. For a creature of the water to be considered clean, it had to possess both fins and scales. Anything that lived in the water but lacked either of these features was deemed unclean. Bottom dwellers, scavengers, creatures with strange hybrid forms. The rules then lift our gaze to the heavens, listing the birds that are to be avoided. This list is dominated by birds of prey and scavengers. Eagles, vultures, hawks, owls. These are creatures associated with death and the consumption of blood. Their nature was seen as being in direct opposition to the principles of life and holiness. The final category in Leviticus's dietary law is perhaps the most alien to our modern sensibilities. The creeping things. The general rule was that all things that swarm or creep upon the earth were unclean, with a fascinating and very specific exception. Those that have jointed legs above their feet, which allow them to leap upon the ground. Beyond diet, the the chapter addresses another crucial aspect of purity: contamination by contact. The carcass of any unclean animal was a potent source of impurity, but an earthen vessel, a clay pot, was different. Because of its porous nature, the impurity was considered to have been absorbed into it. The law commanded that such a pot must be broken. From the grand classifications of the animal kingdom, the narrative of Leviticus shifts to the most intimate and miraculous of human experiences: childbirth. This transition, while joyous, was also seen as a powerful and mysterious event that placed the mother in a temporary state of ritual uncleanness. If a woman gave birth to a son, she would be considered ceremonially unclean for 7 days. She would then continue in a state of purification for another 33 days. If the child born was a daughter, the timelines were doubled. The initial period of uncleanness would last for 14 days, and continue for an additional 66 days. This mandated time of seclusion served a deeply practical and compassionate purpose. It provided the new mother with a protected period for recovery and rest. It was a sacred quarantine, a divinely sanctioned maternity leave that honored the immense physical and emotional journey of the mother. Once the prescribed days of purification were complete, the mother's period of separation would come to an end. She was to bring a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. The law, however, demonstrated a profound understanding of social and economic realities. It included a compassionate provision for those who could not afford a lamb. The priest would then offer these sacrifices on her behalf, making atonement for her, and she would be declared clean. This concluding ritual was a beautiful and necessary public acknowledgement of the mother's journey, ensuring the mother felt supported, honored, and ultimately fully restored. After addressing the sacred transitions of birth, the laws of Leviticus now turn to a matter of grave concern for any community: the threat of contagious disease. Chapter 13 provides an incredibly detailed manual for the diagnosis of a condition broadly translated as leprosy. The responsibility for diagnosing these conditions fell to the priest. He would look for specific signs. The first key indicator was whether the hair in the affected area had turned white. The second was whether the sore appeared to be deeper than the surrounding skin. If both of these signs were present, the priest could make an immediate diagnosis. He was to pronounce the person unclean. What if the signs were ambiguous? The law provided a crucial next step: quarantine. He would place the individual in isolation for a period of 7 days. After the 7 days had passed, the person would be brought back. If he observed that the affliction had not spread, he would instead order a second 7-day quarantine. If, after 14 days of isolation, the sore had faded and had not spread, the priest would pronounce the affliction to be a simple rash, and declare the person ritually clean. However, if at any point, the priest saw that the sore had visibly spread on the skin, the diagnosis was confirmed. The priest would pronounce the person unclean. The concept of zera'at in Leviticus was not limited to human skin. The law addresses a similar affliction on fabrics and leather goods. The priest would begin examination and quarantine, isolate the article for 7 days. If the stain had spread, it was malignant. The item was declared permanently unclean. It had to be destroyed, burned in fire. If the stain remained, even without spreading, the item was still unclean. The contaminated patch was cut out. If the stain reappeared elsewhere, the entire article had to be burned. After the long and painful isolation, Leviticus chapter 14 opens a path toward hope and restoration. Once verified, a mysterious ceremony began, centered on 2 living clean birds: cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and a hyssop branch. One bird was killed in an earthen vessel over living water. Next, the priest took the living bird, the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop. He dipped all of them into the killed bird's blood over the fresh water. The priest sprinkled the blood and water mixture on the person 7 times. He then pronounced the person ceremonially clean. Finally, he carried the living bird to an open field and set it free. As the bird flew away, it carried impurity and memory of affliction away from the person and community. The ritual of the 2 birds marked the beginning, not the end. The individual was required to wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe. After this, the person was permitted to re-enter the camp, but they still could not yet enter their own tent for 7 more days. On the 8th day, the journey culminated at the entrance of the tabernacle. The person was to bring a series of prescribed offerings. The priest would then take some of the blood and apply it to the right earlobe, the right thumb, and the big toe of the right foot of the person being cleansed. Finally, the priest would take some of the oil and repeat the action. The rest of the oil was poured on the person's head. Just as Leviticus described a leprosy that could affect garments, chapter 14 extends this concept to the very houses people lived in. Upon receiving the report, the priest's first instruction was for the homeowner to empty the house of all its contents. If the mold had spread, he would command that the contaminated stones be torn out. The surrounding plaster was to be scraped from all the interior walls. If the plague of mold reappeared, the house was declared permanently unclean and beyond saving. The homeowner had to demolish it completely. However, if the plague did not return, the priest would perform a cleansing ceremony for the house. This ceremony purified the dwelling, declaring it fit for habitation. Chapter 15 of Leviticus addresses the natural, yet ritually significant subject of bodily discharges, beginning by discussing a man who has an unnatural or prolonged discharge. The impurity was not just in the man himself, but was highly communicable through contact. Anything the man with the discharge sat on became unclean. Anyone who touched his bed also became unclean, and would need to wash themselves and their clothes. Once he was healed, he was to bring an offering, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. The laws of purity extended with equal seriousness to women. Leviticus 15 addresses the regular, monthly period of menstruation. This rule fostered a deep respect for the woman's monthly cycle and created a rhythm of intimacy and separation within marriage. The chapter then discusses the case of a woman who experiences an abnormal flow of blood. Once she was healed, she was required to count off 7 days for her purification. On the 8th day, she was to bring an offering. The priest would make atonement for her before the Lord, cleansing her from the impurity of her discharge. This final ritual brought her journey to a close, formally and publicly restoring her to a state of wholeness and reintegrating her fully into the spiritual life of the holy community. Our journey through these 5 chapters of Leviticus has taken us into a world that can feel, at first, both strange and severe. But to view these laws as primitive relics would be to miss the profound and enduring blueprint hidden within them. The core principle weaving through all these regulations is the idea of order versus chaos, wholeness versus brokenness. This pursuit of holiness was not an individualistic quest. It was a deeply communal endeavor. The health, purity, and well-being of one person directly impacted the entire camp. As we step back, a larger, more universal message comes into focus. Beyond the symbolic language of purity, these chapters of Leviticus contain a powerful and timeless call to care. Think of the priest as a public health officer, a diagnostician, and a counselor all in one. The provision for the poor to bring a simpler offering all point to a system designed to uphold justice and dignity. The ultimate goal was not permanent exclusion, but healing and reintegration. This ancient text challenges us to consider how we, in our own time, care for our communities. How do we ensure that everyone has a path to restoration and belonging? While we may no longer follow the letter of these ancient laws, their spirit endures as a profound reminder. To live a holy life is to live a life of awareness, of discernment, and most importantly, of care for one another. We will continue with another beautiful story from Bible in our next video. If you have not, please subscribe to this channel to help us to grow these contents to wider audience. Thanks for watching.